All right, hello again, everybody. So this is part two for the lecture on March 11th, and we are going to look at, in part two, late Joseon foreign relations. So um, in part one, we looked at how the Joseon dynasty government was structured. Now we're going to look at how the Joseon dynasty dealt with other governments, other states. And given Korea's geographic location, because it is in this area where Japan is to the south and the southeast, and China is to the west, and then we have in this northeastern area these aggressive, hostile tribes, whether it be the Jurchens or the Manchus or the Mongols or whoever they were. Um, there's, for better or for worse, a lot of contact between these different states. And so by the time we get to the Joseon dynasty, one of the questions then becomes, okay, how do we get along with our neighbors? How do we stabilize the region so that we have a certain amount of security? But most importantly, how does Joseon then maintain its sovereignty and its independence? And this becomes particularly relevant because the Ming Dynasty in China is so powerful. So the tributary system, this was the system of foreign relations at the time. The tributary system had been in formation for many hundreds of years prior to this, but it becomes pretty much full-blown and operational beginning in the 15th to 16th centuries. The basic logic behind this system is that China is the center of the world and the source of civilization. And this civilization emanates outwards. And so the neighboring states, they are barbarian, but there are different degrees of barbarism. So depending on if, how much you subscribe to Confucian ideology, how erudite or how sophisticated your scholarship is, Confucian scholarship is, then all of these things then determine how civilized you are, even though you are not China and you are outside of China. So, and then depending on one's level of civilization, this also determined how China then dealt with that particular country. So if you were highly civilized, like a state like the Joseon dynasty, then there was frequent contact and a lot of exchange between the two countries. If you were not civilized and you were barbarian, so for example, Western countries, European countries were considered to be very barbarian, then the Chinese did not want to deal with them at all. So this idea of civilization and how civilized your country was, this then governed the relations between the states, between China and other countries. So the framework of this system is that we have China, which is the Middle Kingdom, and the Emperor of China is the Son of Heaven. So he is given the mandate of heaven, which is the right to rule over all that is under heaven. And the other states, so they are the suzerain power, and then the vassal states or the tribute states, they are to show their respect to the Middle Kingdom through forms of ritual tribute. And these were arranged in a hierarchical order. So those very civilized countries, again, like the Joseon dynasty, they held a higher place amongst the different tribute states or the vassal states. And then other countries were given lower state. And then this determines so what kind or how often that country would be able to visit China, um, what kind of gifts that they were given from the emperor. And so it really governed the whole system of exchange between China and these other countries. The general ideology behind this system is that the emperor was omnipotent, so he's all powerful, he's omnicompetent, he is the ultimate leader, he is also the ultimate moral example because he has been given this Confucian mandate of heaven. And for the Chinese, this was not particular to Asia or East Asia. These concepts and these principles they felt were universal and that they applied to the entire world. So the Middle Kingdom was not just the Middle Kingdom in Asia, but it was the Middle Kingdom period. And they felt that this hierarchy of civilization, this applied to the entire world. The ideology that governed foreign relations was that for the dynasty, if there was inside disorder, so some kind of domestic problems and disturbances, along with outside calamity, so external foreign pressure or aggression or attacks, that combination usually led to the fall of the dynasty. And this was something that Confucius, when he developed his ideas, this is one of the things that he took note of, was because he was looking around. This was a state of chaos in China, in ancient China, and he was trying to figure out, okay, why has our dynasty declined and is about to fall apart? And what he identified was this inside disorder, outside calamity. So this then affects attitudes and practices towards other countries, how China deals with other countries. And there is a level of inclusiveness as it relates to those who are civilized or considered to be civilized. So again, using the example of the Joseon dynasty, because they had implemented Confucian ideology as their official ideology, and because over time they have really a sophisticated development of Confucian scholarship, the Chinese regarded them as highly civilized, and then to include them within this realm of civilization of which China was the center, the Chinese emperors would then bestow titles upon foreign kings like the kings in the Joseon dynasty. So when a king would assume the throne, this would then be documented in a letter and then sent to the Chinese emperor. And if the Chinese emperor approved, then he would write a letter of investiture, which essentially was giving his approval and saying that we recognize this king as the legitimate ruler of Joseon. Now, Joseon did not need this for the kings to rule, but it was nice for the kings to have this authority backing them up and recognizing them as the legitimate ruler. And so for some Joseon dynasty kings, it was important for them to get this letter of investiture, because then it strengthened their own power and the power of the throne. But again, this is all hierarchical, because there's only one emperor, the Chinese emperor, and then everybody else, all the other rulers of the different countries are kings. So there's a status distinction in the titles. All right, so let's look at the foreign relations between Joseon and Ming China specifically. The Ming Dynasty was established in 1368, which is not that long before the Joseon Dynasty was established in 1392. And if you look at this map of the Ming Empire, this is a massive state. And they had extremely strong military and naval power. For them to be able to consolidate this area took great strength and resources. And so the Ming Dynasty, the Ming Empire, was the strongest political entity in the region. And if we look at the size of the Ming Empire in comparison with the Joseon Dynasty, the Ming Empire dwarfs Joseon. And so to have this very powerful neighbor just adjacent to you, it is extremely important for Joseon to maintain a stable relationship with the Ming. The last thing that the Joseon Dynasty wants to do is to anger or upset the Ming and then give them pretense to be able to attack the Joseon Dynasty, because if they were to attack Joseon, the Joseon does not have the kind of military strength to fend off the Ming Dynasty. So it's really in their own best interests for self-preservation for the Joseon Dynasty to maintain stable, friendly relations with Ming China. So this was priority number one for the Joseon Dynasty. Just to illustrate how powerful the Ming were, you might recognize this. Some of you may have even visited this. This is the Great Wall of China. Do you know how long the Great Wall is? It is longer. I'm going to ask you to maybe look this up, but it is longer than the width of the United States. It's very long. And because there were always these aggressive and hostile neighbors to the north of China, and this is one of the reasons why they built this wall, was to act as a barrier from these northern invaders coming into the Chinese mainland. But also another reason is because this really was a symbol of the Ming Dynasty's power and strength. The wall had been started being constructed earlier to the Ming Dynasty, but it was the Ming Dynasty that finished construction. And their ability to mobilize resources, both physical resources and labor, in order to finish this project was really a great symbol of their power at the time. You might recognize this as well. This is the Forbidden City where the Chinese emperor lived. It is, if any of you have visited it, it is indeed a city. It is huge. And there are 9,999 rooms in the Forbidden City, which means that if you were born in the Forbidden City and you slept in a different room every single night, by the time you slept in all of the rooms, you'd be about 27 years old. So this again is just a symbol of how strong and powerful the Ming were. All right, so because of this, because you have such a formidable neighbor right next to you, it was imperative for Joseon to maintain relations with them. Now, if we look at how the Joseon Dynasty dealt with Japan, this was very different. So beginning at the end of the Goryeo dynasty, the problem with piracy really just gets out of control. And because Korea is a peninsula, this is particularly problematic. So you have all of this coastline around Korea, and these pirates, they would attack the coastline, they would take whatever they wanted, they would kidnap people and enslave them, and then they would burn everything down. So this coastline along here was just completely devastated, and a lot of the people had to retreat into the mountain areas for protection and to be safe. And then these pirates not only attacked Korea, but they also attacked along the this coastline of China. And it was the same problem. They would do the same thing. They would attack along here. And so both the Ming Dynasty and the Joseon Dynasty repeatedly made requests to Japan to get this piracy problem under control. But at the time, in the 14th century, Japan was a decentralized country. They had not gotten things together. And so because they have internal conflict and struggles, they're not able to pay the proper attention to the piracy problem. So it remains a huge issue and continues to cause all kinds of death and destruction. And so finally, the Joseon Dynasty says, okay, we need to do something about this. And the Ming Dynasty, they were sufficiently angered by the piracy problem, that they told Japan, because Japan had frequent trade with China, and they also wanted to trade with Korea as well. This is an island nation. They don't have a lot of natural resources. They don't have a lot of arable land to produce enough rice, and so they want to engage in trade. But the Ming Dynasty, they were so angry with this, they said to Japan, we are cutting you off when it comes to trade. You are only allowed to trade with us once every 10 years at this port, one port here in Ningbo. So this was a huge blow to Japan to be cut off from trade. There is also limited contact with the West during the Joseon Dynasty with the expansion of Western empires. As you know, there were different colonies that were established in the Americas. But after the American Revolution and the decline of the Spanish and the Portuguese empires, you see Britain and France expanding to other areas as well as the Dutch, and then entering into the Asian region. And so as a result of this, we begin to see some infrequent contact with the West, particularly with China and Japan. So through the Silk Road or through other trade routes, the British, the French, the Dutch that would come to China seeking trade. And then the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the Dutch were also trading with Japan. But once Japan centralized, then they limited their contact with the West also. Okay, so if we look at Joseon-Ming relations specifically, again, we have this principle of hierarchy that is applied. And the Ming Dynasty takes a superior position, the Joseon Dynasty takes an inferior position, the Joseon Dynasty is a vassal, and the Ming Dynasty is a suzerain state. A suzerain is a dominant state controlling the foreign relations of a vassal state, but it allows the vassal state to remain sovereign. So basically what this means is that the Ming Dynasty did not interfere in internal politics. It did not take over or colonize the Joseon Dynasty. The Joseon Dynasty was sovereign, it was independent, and it ruled and governed as it saw fit. However, because the Ming Dynasty was the suzerain state, it wanted to be recognized as the suzerain power, and so Joseon, when it dealt with any other countries, it had to first recognize that the Ming Dynasty was at the top, and that it was its suzerain power, and then all other countries would fall below that. So again, this principle of hierarchy was applied to foreign relations. All right. And then the tribute system, which was this ritual expression of the acceptance of Chinese suzerainty, so the recognition of China as the suzerain power. This was all expressed through ritual. When the Joseon Dynasty would send embassies to the Ming capital, they would perform certain rituals, and this would all be a show of how they were recognizing China as the suzerain power. The Joseon Dynasty had to declare their loyalty to China. On these embassies, they would present tribute goods to the Chinese, and they used the Chinese calendar. Chinese envoys would then be sent back to the Joseon Dynasty. They would give letters of investiture from the emperor. They would also present gifts from the emperor. Usually the gifts that the Joseon Dynasty received were of much more value than what the Joseon Dynasty gave to the Ming. And as a result of this, over time, Joseon became the model tribute state. They were amongst all of the tribute states at the top. They were considered to be the most civilized, the most scholarly, the most Confucian, the most moral, and they were the model tribute state. All right, so why would the Joseon Dynasty participate in this? If they are taking an inferior position, they have to acknowledge that the Ming are superior to them, that they are the suzerain power. Why would the Joseon Dynasty participate in this? And why would the Ming Dynasty also participate in this? Why wouldn't the Ming Dynasty just go in and conquer Joseon? If they had consolidated that huge territory and pushed out all of these other powerful neighbors, why wouldn't they then just take over Joseon? That is something that we're going to go over in part 3 of the lecture. So I'd like you to write down maybe a few of your thoughts as to why both the Joseon Dynasty and the Ming Dynasty would participate in this kind of a system, and then we will resume with this lecture in part 3.